Today, I'm going to talk to you about wholesale distribution. It's actually critical and no one talks about it. You hear in the news and everyone's talking about how this market might be monopolistic.
Monopoly power.
Monopolization.
This market's controlled by an oligopoly or a couple players here and there. But this is the thing. What most people don't look at is the thing in the middle that really control our supply chains. And that's what's called wholesale distribution.
3, 2, 1, and go!
Okay, so what is wholesale distribution? It's actually a pretty simple concept. A wholesaler or distributor, that's the same thing. For the purpose of the video, we are just going to refer to it as a distributor, is a middleman or intermediary between a buyer and a supplier. And they oftentimes provide a lot of value for both parties in a transaction, and that's the reason why they exist. On the supplier side, they don't want to deal with things like logistics and fulfillment, and most importantly, finding and convincing customers to buy their product. They just want to make the best product possible and focus on that. Now, on the buyer side, they don't want to deal with every individual supplier. It's time consuming, it's a pain, and they have to get all their systems integrated. It's really cumbersome for especially larger companies. So they would much rather work with a distributor that might offer several products or even hundreds or thousands of products into their catalog. And a distributor does all of this. In exchange, they take a margin or a cut of what the sale is going to be. The history of wholesale distribution dates back all the way to ancient times when people started to develop local trade routes and marketplaces. And as society grew and commerce expanded, the need for intermediaries between producers and the buyers became essential. Now, here's the interesting part. As we've entered this globally connected industrialized economy, the need for efficient trade and to manage complex supply chains has only risen. And as a result, these distributors have really gained some outsized power in the markets where they operate. And this is really where the big changes happened. Over the past 50 years, as we entered this era of mass consumerism, these global retail chains have grown so much and gained so much power that they've turned essentially many of our markets into what's called a monopsony. What's a monopsony? Glad you asked. Well, a monopsony is when you have many different suppliers in a market and only a few key big buyers. So the buyers basically have all the power. And so what has happened is the buyers, in this case, the retail chains, are exerting all of their power through the distributors onto the supplier. And then we entered into this era of e-commerce and online retail, and everyone thought that this would kind of change the game and give power back to the suppliers. And unfortunately, we've just kind of seen a lot of this behavior just get exacerbated. So if you go to many different online retail stores today, they do the same thing. They stand in between the consumer and the producer. And so the reality is this: one of the bugs of our modern day capitalist system is it completely just disconnects us from our means of production. The consumer is not connected directly to the producer. How does this whole distribution thing work in practice? Let's say I'm a supplier and I make premium laptop bags and I want to sell those bags at a variety of consumer electronics retail stores. In order to do that, I have to work with a distributor that works with these retailers, or some retailers have their own distribution function in-house, and to get my product placed on their shelves. And so if that product is going to sell for $40 retail to the end customer, we have to work backwards to understand what the supplier's reality is under this model. So let's dig into it. So if I'm selling a laptop bag for $40 to the end customer, the retailer, let's just use Best Buy as an example, right? If they typically want to double their money, it might take a little bit less, but on average, they want to double their money or have a 50% margin. This means Best Buy is willing to buy the $40 laptop bag for $20. And they buy that from the distributor. Enter the distributor. Now, the distributor needs to make their margin for doing things like finding the customer or getting this product on the shelves, handling the logistics, maybe some of the fulfillment. And typically distributors, they'll be anywhere between 10% to 30%. So let's use a 20% number just to take a midpoint. And so if the distributor needs to make their 20% and they're selling it for $20 to Best Buy, that means that they can buy it for a little over $16. And so that means that the supplier receives a little over $16 for selling their laptop bag, even though the end customer is paying $40. So you get the point. It's a pretty straightforward example. Everyone needs to take their margin along the way. And in this case, if I want to get on the shelves of a Best Buy or any regional or large retailer, I have to go through their distribution function, whether they're doing that in-house or they have a selected group of distributors I have to work through. And oftentimes, if I'm selling that laptop bag, my customer is actually the distributor. So I don't even know what deal those distributors have with the retailers. And that's where things get a little bit hairy. Okay, so let's get into the hairiness a little bit. I don't know if hairiness is a word, but we're going to roll with it. And we're going to use the example of the supermarket industry in the United States. And let's take Whole Foods for an example. If I am a supplier and I want to get my food product into Whole Foods, I have to typically work with one or two distributors, UNFI or KeHE. And these distributors, when I sell to Whole Foods, I have no interaction with Whole Foods when I'm selling the product. I'm just interacting with the distributor. So I actually don't know the end price that Whole Foods pays for the product. That's problem one. Now, problem two for an emerging supplier is once you kind of get into working with these distributors, there's all types of chargebacks and fees that you might not realize when you're entering into this relationship. For example, if you start selling your product and it's a new product and it's not selling that well, there's all types of chargebacks for unsold inventory, there's stocking fees, they have all these different fees that they charge you throughout the process that really cut into your margin and makes it really challenging. And then the third thing is payment terms. So what that means is if I sell a product to Whole Foods through one of these distributors, it's typically anywhere between a net 30, net 60. Some retailers go up to net 120. And what that means is they will pay you within 30, 60, 90, or 100 days, depending on the terms, after they receive the product. Now, anyone will tell you in practice, especially if you're a smaller supplier, how often they get paid on time. And if these large companies respect those timelines and when they start calculating those timelines. So all three of these things make it really, really challenging for suppliers to enter into kind of traditional retail, especially when working with larger retailers who have all the distribution and the power. So you're kind of forced to work with them because they do have so much distribution. If selling through traditional retail and working with their distributors is so painful for suppliers today and the cards are stacked against them, the next question is, what about online retail? Well, it's actually not so different today, but that was not the case 10 years ago. And the main reason why was these online retail platforms like Amazon, a decade ago, they needed the sellers. They needed the inventory to attract the buyers. They actually had no market power and very little leverage over these sellers. And then what has happened over the past 10 years is as the technology has developed and it's become so easy to sell products online, retail platforms have gained so much market power that they've started to introduce all types of fees and required advertising if you want your product to show up on the first page of results, which is where the majority of purchases actually happen. So in today's world, for many suppliers selling online, their margins look exactly like, or in some instances worse than selling through traditional retail. Let's look closer into the world's largest online retail platform, Amazon, and do it from a seller perspective. Now, the point of going through this is not to pass judgment on Amazon's business practices, whether you agree with them or disagree with them. It's really just to show you what a seller's reality is today and how it looks different than several years ago. So back in 2006, Amazon launched something called FBA, which stands for Fulfillment by Amazon. And it was revolutionary at the time. What it was they offered small businesses warehousing and fulfillment services for their products. So for the first time ever, you could make a product or have someone make a product for you and send it directly to Amazon, and they would handle the rest, including finding customers to buy it. Now, for several years, a tremendous amount of value was created for sellers and for Amazon, but the market dynamics changed. Amazon started to find much more competition in the whole online retail space, and they were under pressure to continue to increase their margins and continue to lower prices so they were competitive in the market. And so what they did, because they had so much market power now and all the buyers were coming to their site, is they've passed a lot of that on to the seller in the form of a variety of fees. So let's dig through those fees one by one. Okay, the first one is the Amazon referral fee. And this is just a straight commission of 8 to 15% that Amazon charges sellers on every sale that happens on the platform. This is no different than any other online retailer or marketplace that has a transaction fee. The second charge are related to fulfillment and storage fees if businesses use the FBA service by Amazon. Now, this one gets a little hairy because A, it's highly variable depending on the volumes and the weights of your product and what services you actually use. But B, once you start working with Amazon, they introduce all these other fees that you might not have been aware of, and they do add up. So this includes return processing fees and low inventory fees. The list kind of goes on, and you have to actually start working and selling through Amazon to really experience all of them. And they do add up. And as you can see through a quick scroll of this website, the list is pretty long. Let's look into the biggest one, advertising fees. And this is where the biggest changes happened over the past few years for new sellers entering the Amazon ecosystem. And this is how it goes. In order to rank high on organic search results on the first page in Amazon, you need to have as many 4- and 5-star reviews as possible for your product. And the problem is when you're a new supplier with a new product, you don't have any reviews. So that leaves you one choice, and that is advertise. When you advertise, your product can show high up on the page as a sponsored post or a sponsored listing. And what that has turned into now is new sellers are required to spend anywhere we've seen 10, 20, 30% of the price of the product on advertising just to get noticed. There's some third-party research out there that shows somewhere between 70 and 90% of all purchase decisions from buyers on Amazon are made on just that first page of results. So that all speaks for itself. So this has kind of come full circle between all the other fees, many of which, by the way, are warranted, between the commissions, the FBA fees, and then we'll just call them miscellaneous fees. That combined with this new dynamic over the past few years around needing to advertise just to show up on a search result to get noticed has become very challenging for many suppliers. And I can tell you from personal experience that it has become much less attractive for new sellers to enter the Amazon ecosystem today. A few companies that I've invested in, they sell their products both through Amazon and traditional retail, and their margins look extremely similar once you take into account all the fees. And so if we go back to that example of the laptop case that's being sold for $40 at a Best Buy, the supplier only receives a little bit over $16 of that. His or her economics might look very similar of the $40 laptop case sold on Amazon. They might only end up receiving somewhere around that net of all the fees that they pay. And so this begs the question, if both traditional retail and the wholesale distributors have all this market power, and now all these online retailers have gained to have so much market power over the sellers, where does that leave you as someone who makes a product? Ding, ding! You got it. The only option is going direct. Suppliers today have no other option other than to sell directly to their customers if they want to maintain margin, and then most importantly, if they want to maintain the relationship with their customer and get the data so they can make more informed decisions. It's the only way to do this. And now it sounds all well and good, and you hear of all these direct-to-consumer companies, and this is the reality. It's really hard to do, not from a small proof of concept standpoint or to gain some distribution to show that the market likes your product. It's really hard to do at scale, and I'm going to show you why. I'm going to share a statistic with you that I think most of you are going to find very interesting and surprising when it comes to retail sales. And all of these numbers come from the US Census Bureau. Here you go. In the US, total retail sales in 2023 was more than $7 trillion. And close to 85% of all those dollars spent were actually in bricks and mortar store. So what's fascinating is e-commerce only represents 15% of all retail sales in the United States. So if you check this graph out here over the past 10 years, this shows the share of US retail revenue at bricks and mortar stores. It's gone from 93% down to about 85%. Now, it's definitely chipping away, and e-commerce is obviously continuing to grow faster than bricks and mortar, but it's not nearly as much as most people think. Bricks and mortar still dominates retail in the US. Now, this statistic is exactly why nearly all direct-to-consumer companies that are successful end up going to traditional retail, because at some point, once you reach a certain size and you need to look to continue to grow and gain additional distribution, you need to go to where the dollars are being spent. So even companies like Warby Parker and Harry's that were smashing successes in one of the category defining companies in the direct to consumer movement ended up expanding into traditional retail. So now we're going to go into the dirty little secret about traditional retail that no one seems to be talking about. Many big box retailers essentially operate like banks. And what I mean by that is they run their businesses off the back of their suppliers through something called payment terms. We mentioned it earlier in the video, but I'll repeat the concept real quick. The concept of payment terms is super simple. I, as a supplier, sell my product to a retailer. I make the product, send it out to be delivered. And then once that retailer receives the product and puts it on the shelves, they then pay me at some later date. That can be 30, 60, 90. We've seen some retailers pay 150, 180 days after receiving the product. And so you might not think that's a big deal. Beyond the fact that it puts a huge burden on the cash position of the supplier, it is fascinating once you dig into the numbers of what the retailers gain from offering these longer payment terms. Before we dive into the payment term calculation, it's important to remember the basic rule of thumb for retail, and it's this. Retailers typically sell products at their store for 2 times the price of what they pay for it. So in the context of Home Depot, let's use this example. Let's say they order 100 cases of paint from a supplier. They only need to sell 50 cases of that paint to recoup the cost of the product to send back to the supplier. So let's run this out. Let's assume Home Depot buys this 100 cases of paint from a supplier 3 times per year, so a total of 300 cases of paint. And every time they purchase that paint, they sell half of it within 20 days after putting it on the shelves. So that means after 20 days of receiving the product, they have all the cash that they owe the supplier, and this happens 3 times per year. But since their terms are net 30, that means they don't pay their supplier till 10 days after. So that means Home Depot is holding onto the cash for 10 days in their bank account when it is technically should be owed to the supplier. Now, this is where it gets super interesting. Yes, 100 cases of paint and a few $1,000s here and there, it doesn't add up. So in 2022, Home Depot did about $157 billion in annual revenue, annual sales, and their cost of goods sold was about $105 billion. And what cost of goods sold simply means is this is the money that they spent with their suppliers. And they made about $52 billion in 2022. So let's go back up to that number, the $105 billion. That is the amount of money that Home Depot spent with their suppliers. But where it does add up is when Home Depot is spending $105 billion with their suppliers each year, and if they average those 30 days where they're holding the cash instead of sending it right back to the suppliers and they have that in a savings account, if the savings account is paying 4% per year, and over the course of the year, there's $105 billion that are in a savings account for 30 days at 4%, that's about $350 million in interest. It's mind-boggling, and no one even thinks about this. And now let me explain something to you. This is assuming that the retailer actually pays them within 30 days. We've seen some situations where retailers pay in 120, 150, 180 days. It's ridiculous. Okay, those were a lot of numbers to handle, and it might have been over your head, but we just wanted to point out conceptually how it works. And we did make assumptions on how quick, obviously, Home Depot is selling the product. That is not necessarily the case with most retailers, but most retailers also don't pay within 30 days. We're just trying to show that these retailers are utilizing the cash that comes in from selling the product, and they're holding it. They're not paying the supplier right away. And when you're dealing with billions and billions of dollars of cash and you're holding someone's cash and you're earning interest on it, you're actually using the supplier's cash to help finance your own business. And it's become very, very difficult because if you're a small supplier and you're working with a large retailer like Home Depot, and if you don't get paid on time, what are you going to say? You have no leverage. You have no market power with them. And it's really, really challenging. At this point, you're probably saying, Jordan, what do you want us to do? First, you're telling us traditional retail and working with wholesale distributors is really hard. They basically control our supply chains and have all the market power. And then you're telling me that even online retail is turned into a similar dynamic where they have all the power over the sellers. And then we go to the point where it's like, okay, the only way to do it then is to go direct. But then if we go direct, we can only get to a certain type of scale. And then we're going to be forced to go to bricks and mortar because that's where the vast majority of dollars are being spent. This is all true. I've never said it's going to be easy. But my point is this. If you can figure out going direct and you can figure that out at scale, two really important things happen. One, which is you get additional margin capture, which is very straightforward. You can maybe save 20, 30, 40% on your margin. And then you can use that money to then drive back into the business and to improve your product. And then two, which is the most critical, is you're having direct relationship and conversation with your customers. You'll get to know what they're looking for, what they're happy with, what they're not happy with. You can serve them directly. And you also have all of their data and information that'll help you make better, more informed decisions. And the reality is this. If you want to compete in today's market where there's just abundance of everything, you're going to need to go direct. It's the only way to create a competitive advantage and to actually control your own destiny. So I wish you all luck, but what I will tell you this is if we're going to change the way that we consume, and if we're going to make commerce more human, we have no other choice other than to figure out how to either bypass wholesale distribution altogether or change the way that wholesale distribution works.